Hello fans of software development. Hello fans of security. Today I will show you how you can use OpenID Connect in your application, in your web application, to build a single sign-on with your company's identity provider. And this will be super easy, just configuration and using of the Spring framework and the Spring Boot libraries and Spring Security libraries. Yeah, so you don't have to do much. Spring will do the heavy lifting for you. And here in my blog article, I described it, but in this video, I will demonstrate it also. So let's quickly talk first about OpenID Connect. I will focus on the authorization code process. There are several other processes, but we will focus here in this video on the authorization code process for OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect is a way to do a single sign-on. Typically in larger companies, it's very useful if they have a distributed system which consists of several independent systems, like a big shopping application where you have the product pages in first system, then you have a shopping cart, which is the second system, and a checkout process, which is the third system. And you don't want the user to log in each system because that would be a terrible user experience. You want to have you want to do the user one login, and then he is authorized and authenticated in every system. Yeah, and that is what you can achieve with OpenID Connect. So let's have a look on this picture here. It shows how it works in general. We have a client which uses a browser, yeah, and he calls our Spring Boot web application. And if he calls a secured page of the application based on the URL, it's secured, yeah, then we will trigger the single sign-on login process. So let's have a look on this. Here you see my application running as Spring Boot application on port 8080. So I can type here any kind of URL. They are all unsecured, so I'm allowed to see this page as an anonymous user. But I have provided here a link which points to an authenticated URL. We will see this later in the Spring Security configuration. And if I click on this link, I'm automatically redirected to the OpenID provider. In this case here, I'm using Deutsche Telekom's SAM3 OpenID provider. This could be also the Google OpenID provider or the Facebook Meta OpenID provider. There are many OpenID providers which you can use. But since I'm working for Deutsche Telekom, I will use this for this demonstration. Okay, so I'm now here after I called this authenticated URL. I was redirected to the single sign-on OpenID provider. So I'm doing the login, not in my Spring application. I'm doing it here at the OpenID provider. And after clicking to log in, I'm redirected to my application. But what was just here a switch of one page was several requests exchanged in a row. So the OpenID provider did a redirect to the Spring application. And as a part of this redirect, we received a so-called authorization code. The Spring web application then sent a request to the OpenID provider's token endpoint to exchange the authorization code against an OpenID token, in this case, JWT, JSON Web Token. And based on this, we have now an authenticated session from our client to the Spring application, and we have an authenticated user. And we can use now the application, which doesn't do much besides offering a logout button. Here you can see that I'm logged in, and that is the user ID which our identity system at Telekom provides to me. Other systems might return here an email address or the username. That really depends on which kind of permissions you configured or claims you configured with your OpenID provider. So, but this is now the proof that I'm logged in. And of course, I can do a log out, and then I'm logged out, and I'm directed to the Telecom homepage. Yeah, that is again another configuration which we have here on our OpenID provider. That can be completely different in your case, or you could be redirected again to your application. Okay, so let's step now into the code. And one more thing which is also interesting, I had the application running here, and in the logs, if you switch the logs to debug log level, you can read exactly what happened and how those steps worked. Yeah, so this was on my application the start into the single sign-on process by redirecting to this telecom identity provider. Then here I received the redirect after successful login, which contained the code. And then the next step of my application was to send a post request to this tokens endpoint. So typically, the OpenID provider offers also a tokens endpoint. You can call it to exchange the code into a token. Yeah, and that is what we see here. And all this stuff has been done by the Spring Security Framework for us. Okay, and in order to get this running on your side, I have created here a Cradle project. I'm using Spring Boot 3.0.2, which is as of today the latest version, and I'm using Java in version 17. But that doesn't really matter here in this. Okay, if I would use an older version, I would be in conflict with Spring Boot, so I have to use at least Java 17. But in general, it works also with older Spring Boot versions, and then you can use Java 11, for example. And the important thing is the dependency. Yeah, so I get all of this, what I showed you, activated by having this dependency. It's a Spring Boot starter OAuth 2 client. Now, this is a dependency which injects also Spring Security to my system, but in general, this is the OAuth 2 client which injects the process of the OpenID Connect login to my application. The other dependencies are just for my application, yeah, like those two, Spring Boot Starter Web and Spring Boot Starter Timeleaf. That is how I set up my application. My application is a web application, so we have a simple Timeleaf template, and there are two cases. I might have a user which is not null, so we have a logged in user, then I'm just displaying it, and I display this user's name, which is in the case before the number. And in the case that there is no user, yeah, we see this page, please log in, you are an anonymous user. So that is super simple. And the interesting parts of my application are happening on the one hand in the Spring Security configuration, which we will see later, and on the other hand in the application properties or application YAML configuration. So here you can see my application YAML configuration, or you can see, to be honest, a faked one. Yeah, I show you here all the mandatory settings, but not the real credentials from Telecom's OpenID provider. Yeah, so that is hidden in a profile which you see here, but I will not open this. So yeah, here you can see my configuration. The logging part is about the logging, so we can ignore this. And here, this part is the basic configuration for the OpenID Connect. There's one super important thing we have to define, and that is the issuer URI. It is required to get, in best case, all informations about the OpenID provider. Because, yeah, for example, I have here in my browser the Google OpenID configuration. So the issuer URI is this first part of the URL. It's accounts.google.com. And if you would enter this, then if the OpenID provider is following the OpenID defaults, then we have an URL continuing with /well-known/OpenID configuration. And here Spring Boot finds all other informations to follow this OpenID process. For example, Spring Boot finds here the token endpoint, which was used to exchange the authorization code into the JWT web token. And that is what we have seen in the logs below. Yeah? So if you enable debug logging, you will see also the same informations. And there are other important endpoints and configurations for the OpenID process which are needed, for example, to validate the tokens and so on, like the certificates to check if the token is valid. But we don't need to configure this if our OpenID provider is following these defaults, and that means that you have this well-known URL behind the issuer URI, and then it can build up all the stuff on its own. The other important thing is the registration. And here we have, for example, defined that we are using the authorization code flow of OpenID Connect and not anything else. I defined here a client ID and a secret that is required to identify our web application at the OpenID provider, so that no other application can go to this OpenID provider and get the login. Yeah? So you need to identify the Spring application in this case. We need also a redirect URI in this configuration, and that is the URL which is used in the step number 3. Yeah? After our application redirected to the login, the OpenID provider does again a redirect to our application, and this one is based here on this URL. You can see it has some kind of dynamic path. You see the rest of this here. It's just a demo. It's not the real path which we are using in our application, but it could in general look like this. I need this later on in the Spring security configuration in our security filter chain bean, yeah, and therefore I stored it in a separate configuration parameter. The same for the logout, but in this video we will not talk about the logout. And finally, I defined the scope to be OpenID. That was required for our OpenID provider. If you are using, for example, Google, yeah, then Spring Boot is knowing even more about it, and then you don't need to define an issuer URI, you don't need to define the scope. All this is then already pre-configured by Spring Boot. The only thing what you have to share is the client ID and the client secret, because anything else is not a secret, let's say. Yeah. And here's one more important thing. Here I called this SAM. SAM is the name of Telecom's OpenID provider system. Yeah. You can use here any name which fits to your company, or you can name it however you want. This name is later important, but this is not a default which has to be known. Yeah, it's different. But like here, Spring Security OAuth 2 client, yeah, this is like always a default, and then we have always a provider and a registration. The provider needs at least the issuer URI, and the registration needs the details about the client. The client is in this case our Spring Boot application. Okay, so next thing to do is I want to update the Spring security configuration. So here you see right now what we will have at the end. I will delete this for now, so that we see how our application works without all this stuff. So right now I just have added this dependency and I configured it in my application YAML file. And now the application behaves a little bit different. If I call the localhost port 8080, we are directly redirected to the OpenID provider. And that is because there is now an activated authentication for the whole application. The default of Spring Security, as you might have seen in my videos before, is that everything is secured and you need to log in. Yeah, you need to have your own security filter chain bean to adapt it and to make some pages public and accessible for anonymous users so that they can start the login process. Yeah, but let's continue and do a login, and then we will see that we get the next error. You see it here in the logs of my application. It's always retrying because the URLs and the redirects are not properly configured. Yeah, I'm having now here a strange URL which the application doesn't know, and then it retriggers and retriggers login tries, but it doesn't work like this. So we need to have now our own Spring Security security filter chain bean. Yeah, so let's do this as the next step. Let's kill the application now for once and switch to the security configuration. I will copy this basic part now, the first part. If you are interested in this, I will add a link to another video where I'm explaining the basics about Spring Security, and there is an explanation about authorized HTTP requests, request measures, and authenticated, and having any request with free access. Yeah, so this is in detail explained in another video. Feel free to check this. Check the description for blog articles describing here the basics. In order to speed things up, I will not re-explain it in this video. So let's start again our application. And now the expected behavior is that we have one URL which triggers the login because we need here an authenticated user, and any other URL is free to use, and we will see our own application. So if I call it now like this, we see this page because it's a free page to be used. The login didn't work due to this errors. Yeah, so we can now try even other URLs. Yeah, and for all we will just see this page because that is the behavior I configured for my application. Yeah, like any URL is allowed, and in my user controller you can see that any URL will be responded with the default index page, which I showed you at the beginning, and I pass here this OpenID Connect user to the model and view of this page. So the user is input parameter of this method, and then I add it as an object to my model and view, and then it's displayed. Yeah, the username is displayed. And this is the required annotation to get the OpenID user via injection added to this method so that we can use it and deal and check the user. Yeah. Okay, so then let's do as a next step the click on this link, and then we get an error which says 403 forbidden, access denied. Since we are not having a logged in user, we are not allowed to call this secured URL, which we configured exactly here. And in order to get now a user, we need to define a login. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is to configure the login, and we do this on the HTTP security object, http dot OAuth. There are many things, like I will choose the OAuth 2 login now, and I need to define two things as a minimal configuration to get this working. And the first thing is I need to define a login processing URL. And I already configured this here, login process path. And if we go back to the configuration, we see that I stored it here, and this is part of the return URL after the successful login at the OpenID provider. We are coming back to this URL, and then the login processing URL is triggered by this. And what does this mean? Since this is now an OAuth 2 login which is activated, the Spring Security Framework will deal with receiving the authorization code, calling the tokens endpoint, and getting the Java Web Token, and then translating this into our user, which is injected here so that we can afterwards see the page with a logged in user. Yeah, so that is the first part, and then we need one more thing, which is the login page. And the login page is now something which is built of some parts, and it needs to be again aligned with our application properties YAML configuration, like we have here at the beginning. OAuth 2/authorization, yeah, that is some kind of Spring default to trigger the OpenID Connect login. Yeah, so that is the first part, to trigger the login with the identity provider. And in the second part, I have to reuse the name of the identity provider which I configured in my application YAML file. So in my case, it's SAM. In your case, it could be anything else. And so these things have to fit. Yeah, that's really important. And if I restart my application now, the pieces should fit together. I will start at a regular page. I click the login, and then it was directly detected to log me in. And since I have already an existing session from my testing before, I'm directly logged in. So let's retry this in a fresh browser without any existing cookies and without any existing session. So localhost port 8080, it's my application. I can trigger the login. Now for this session, there is no existing single sign-on session. So I have to log in again. And then again, I'm logged in my application and I can use it. The logout is not part of this presentation today. Check my blog if you want to see how it works. Maybe later there will be another video where I will show the logout as a front channel logout. So if you liked my video, please give me a thumb up. If you are interested in seeing more content in the Spring world, please subscribe to my channel and have a nice day. See you next time. Bye bye.